Good morning. It's my first time in Trinidad. I've heard a lot about your country. I grew up with all my cricket heroes from here. I'm very, very happy to be here. Honorable Minister of Tertiary Education, Mr. Chandragupta Prasad, Chairman of YTEPP, Mr. Nigel, Chief Executive, and the Honorable Minister of Education and the Chief of Accreditation. What more can a professor of education want in an audience? So I hope I can get a message across, which I think might interest you. Unfortunately, the message is a little abstract. It isn't as simple as 15 years ago when I did the first hole-in-the-wall experiments. That was very simple. You put a computer out there, you show that the children are learning. People ask you who taught them, and you say nobody. That's pretty clear. But what does it mean eventually? And in those last 15 years, the amount of change that has taken place in our lives and in our societies is so huge that a lot of things that we take for granted need to be redefined. So Mr. Chandragupta mentioned about digital natives. And, and that we out here are the digital immigrants. You know, it would have been nice if that was entirely the case, but it's not. We, my generation, well, actually they are one generation after mine, I think. my generation and this generation, we too, unfortunately, are digital natives of the technology of our time. We come to you, the new generation, with baggage. And that's what I want to try and point out in the rest of this talk. What is that baggage? How do we get rid of it? Because otherwise, we will try to force a new system into an old mold, and it won't fit. You heard from the minister the impressive achievements in enrollments in this country. He made it sound very simple, but I can imagine that it took a lot of work. And I'm sure if we really asked him, it wasn't a question of writing down orders. It was a question of changing the mold into which the new structure can fit. Some people, very few people can do that. He's done it in one sector. I hope you can do it in others. Before I start on my presentation itself, I just want to tell you a very quick and a very recent conversation that I had. Day before yesterday, from the 1st of September, in Britain, computer programming was introduced to 5-year-olds. Okay? And everybody sort of, the BBC and everyone was over there with their cameras, with the 5-year-olds. And, you know, the teachers saying, oh, we need a little more time for training, you know, we need to learn how to do computer programming and coding properly and so on. Until the camera went to one of the 5-year-olds and said, so what do you think of this? And he said, you know, it's a lot easier than I thought. So that's what I mean by when a digital native from another generation encounters the digital native from this one. Okay, all right, can I get to my first, yes, that's right. So it's sort of tentatively called Future of Learning. YTEPP, whom I must thank for, you know, setting this whole thing up. I mean, thank you very much for doing that. YTEPP, as you can see, puts down the title as the Future of Learning Through Technology. Okay, sure, it has to be. But I want to take a first step by saying what would happen if we remove the technology. If we just said future of learning. To me, future of learning through technology makes sense. But there is a generation growing up, and I hope some of them are sitting at the back, who think it's a big deal. What other future can you have? The technology is there all the time. I mean, the person who invented the ballpoint pen may have thought this is the future of writing through technology. We don't think so. We just throw them around. Okay, so technology just sort of goes in. So I'll remove that word. Similarly, there's another word which the previous generation considers very modern, e-learning. I would say to you, remove that word. There is no learning that is not e-learning in today's world. So what's the big deal? Learning, it's learning. So how do we, from where do we start? Well, firstly, I want to start from the school, of course. And here it is, a very familiar picture, except that if I asked you, when do you think this picture was taken? The unfortunate answer is that it could have been taken yesterday or it could have been taken 300 years ago. Okay, we can't really tell. It hasn't changed all that much. Okay, the blackboard changed to white. That's about it. So, now, is that good or is that bad? Well, first of all, what it shows is that the structure you have there, the classroom, is extremely resilient. It's extremely efficiently constructed. That's how it's lasted for 300 years. What does it produce is what we need to look at. And if you look at history, you find that it produces basically three kinds of people. It does so because for the last 300 or 400 years, the entire world was run using essentially three kinds of people. Here they are. The first kind, I don't need to describe them to you. Everybody has them. We forget the fact that in order to have them, you need to have an institution that produces them. What does that institution have to do to produce soldiers? What is the property of a soldier? First and foremost, they are all identical. You can take one and replace it with another one. They should function exactly the same way. Secondly, they must be disciplined. What does that mean? It means that they should follow orders and not ask questions. So the system is engineered to produce that kind of people. What is the point then of going to our primary schools and saying, you know, the children aren't asking creative questions? We told them not to. The second kind of person, this one, remember for 300 years there were no computers, there were no telephones, there was no communication technology at all. So how was all that information processed? So the answer is, it's not that there wasn't a communication technology. There was a communication technology. That communication technology was the clerical administrative machine. It's actually called a machine. And it uses ledgers, it uses very carefully orchestrated chain of command, of permissions, of rubber stamps, of pens and papers, and I mean, many of us here have grown up in that system. Luckily, many of you won't. So, who are these people? They're clerks. What should a clerk be able to do in that 200-year-old machine? First of all, he must have good handwriting, so that what one clerk writes can be read by another one. Secondly, he should have reasonably good spelling, so that he is not misunderstood. Thirdly, he should be able to remember a large set of rules, so that he doesn't all the time have to run to some register to find out what the rule is. He should know them in his head. he must be taught how to memorize well. Fourthly, he must be taught to sit quietly and do his work and not talk with other people. And lastly, he must be taught not to ask too many questions. So do you see again that schooling, to produce that machine, had to produce people like that. These were our instructions. Produce disciplined children who will do the job, listen to your instructions, understand them, be able to read and write very well, and so on and so forth. A third kind of person who we needed for running that newly industrialized world, the factory worker. What are the properties of the factory worker? You should be able to stand at the same spot for 8 hours and do the same thing over and over again without making any mistakes. You mustn't talk, you mustn't ask questions, you must follow instructions. When you build a machine with human beings, each human being has to be produced in that mold of the machine part. We know that now. At that time, we had no choice but to do it that way. And that's how the professions as we know it evolved one after the other. So where was creativity in that world? It was there, but it was produced through a stratified schooling system. The bulk of the schools would produce these three kinds of people. And there would be a few elite schools who would produce, hopefully, the thinkers. It was a hit and miss, accidental kind of situation, but it did the job. We can't afford to have them anymore. So, you know, I'm from St. Xavier's High School, New Delhi, so it didn't make me feel very happy to write that sentence. But somebody had to write it. And, you know, things go obsolete. You can't help it. That's the nature of things. That pen I showed you just now, well, it's kind of obsolete, isn't it? How many lines will I write with that pen before I lose it? The rest of my writing will be on a little machine somewhere. Does the quality of my handwriting count anymore? I don't think so. So we will miss the fountain pen when it's gone, but it has to go when its time is done. We are in that transition, which is why it's so difficult particularly for decision makers in countries to resolve this issue. Shall I improve? Shall I change? Or shall I replace? It's a three-point agenda, and I can see the kind of dilemma that an educational decision maker has to face. And on top of that, you've got to face the parents who barely understand all of this. So you couldn't go to a parent and say, I'm going to stop telling the children to be quiet. They won't understand it. So how shall we make that change? Should we make it at all? Well, I want to give you an example. This was the main form of transportation for several hundred years throughout the world, every country, the horse and carriage. It was an industry on its own. There were beautiful looking vehicles, the beautiful looking horses. There was an entire industry feeding it. There was a whole supply chain for how the horses would be fed so that they're healthy and all right. In every city on this planet, there is the equivalent of a place called hay market. It's no longer there because the horses aren't there and the hay is not required anymore. But it used to be. And then what happened to that? Well, we didn't improve it. We improved it to a certain point, but then suddenly it went away. And it went away because of technology. Actually, not so much the technology of pistons and cylinders, it was actually the physics of internal combustion that changed it. So it was an idea which changed it, to remove the horse. But one more thing happened, which I'm sure the decision makers and the policy makers of the day must have really struggled with. The horse and cart can run on cobbled roads where motor cars find it very difficult to go. So somebody in civil administration would have had to say, we have to change all the roads. And there would have been some prime minister who would have said, have you gone out of your mind? I mean, where am I going to get the money to change all the roads? But they had to. Along with the horse and carriage went another thing. There used to be the guy who was the coachman, the man who drove the vehicle. What would happen to him? But he just has to learn to do something else. Because in the horseless carriage, that guy wasn't required anymore. That was perhaps the biggest change of all. The passengers became the drivers. Now, since your interest is in education, if you try and apply the same paradigm, but teachers are not going to like being called a horse, but remember, I am a teacher myself. But the thing is that can we have the horseless carriage, which goes so much faster and eventually is so much cheaper and easier to maintain than the previous infrastructure? And if you want to further complicate issues, so first you have the horse getting changed by an idea, internal combustion. Then you have a man, a profession which went away, the coachman, because the passengers started driving the vehicle themselves. And third, what's happening, I think from next year onwards, several countries are going to allow driverless vehicles, cars that drive themselves. Britain is one of them. I dread the thought, but it's going to happen. All right. So, a driverless car. But what strikes me as very interesting is that unlike the transition from where the coachman went away and the passengers became the drivers, this time around, nobody is losing a job, but a skill is going extinct. Driving. There will be a generation 50 years from now who will ask you, what does driving mean? And you'll have to say, well, you know, we all used to know there's a clutch, brake, accelerator, gears, the key, you know, driving. And he would say, really? And who does that now? Okay? So that is an even bigger change. It is not a change of technology. It's a change of ideology, of a skill going extinct. And I'm sure that there will be a generation who will ask, did they gain or did they lose? Knowing how to drive is a skill. It tones your mind. It makes you think in a certain way. We're going to take away all that. But generation after generation have said this of skills when they went away. They have to be replaced by other skills. And that makes the job of the people who deal with skill education an extremely challenging one. So what is driving going to be replaced by? What's the human skill that will produce the driverless car? Those guys who were the great drivers of their day, they will now have to move one meta level up to being the creators of the machines that drive. What are those skills? Well, I sort of bumped into all this quite accidentally. And I might confess to you right away that I have no formal background in education. My basic education was in theoretical physics. And that's the subject that I was taught. And in those days, physicists were the only people who could write computer programs. So I became a programmer, and then I became a teacher of computer programming. And then I bumped one day into the hole in the wall. What actually happened was that I was teaching a lot of very rich people's children how to develop computer programs. And, it's all fine. I mean, I had a very posh office in New Delhi, teaching all these rich children. But just outside was a big sprawling slum. And the slum had many children in it. So it didn't make me feel very happy while walking into office every day to think that, how do I know that there aren't dozens and dozens of excellent software developers inside that slum? And I can't get there because teachers like me won't go there. And institutions will not build places in there. They are left to themselves. I decided that I can't do anything about it, but maybe I could make an illustration. So I did an experiment. The experiment was that I can't give them institutions, I can't give them teachers, but I can give them a computer. Because a computer doesn't care if it's in a slum or if it's in an office. Only thing is I have to look after it. So how do you put a computer in a slum? Well, I sort of took a stretch of wall, made a rectangular opening in it, put a glass pane, put the computer behind that, and bricked it up. So it looked a bit like a bank ATM, except that it was low. It was about 3 feet off the ground. So if you're a grown-up person, it's a little bit difficult for you to use that machine. There was a touchpad attached to the wall. So obviously the first people who came there were children, and they asked, what is it? Remember, this is 1999, so there were lots of children who didn't know, had never seen a computer before, didn't know what the internet was, and nobody knew any English. Now, how should I answer that question? What is it? But the obvious answer is to tell them it's a computer. But I didn't. I'll tell you why, and this is very important. Because if I had said that's a computer, then if you ever want to replicate this experiment anywhere else, you would need someone who can say that's a computer. There were many places on the planet in those days where there was no such person to say that. So what I said to the children when they said, what is it, was, I don't know. Because I figured that there are many places and many millions of people in the world who can very easily say that. I don't know. So I said, I don't know. The children then said, can we touch it? And I said, well, it's on your side of the wall, so you can do what you like with it. And I went away. Why did I go away? Because if I stood there, nothing happened. They just stood there as well. As soon as I moved away, they swarmed around the computer. And within about 8 hours' time, one of my colleagues came back and said the children are browsing and they're teaching each other how to browse. So I said, how can they do that? How do they understand anything? And he said, I don't know. The theory at that time was that I had all these students who were passing by, so maybe one of those students stopped and showed them how to use the mouse. I thought that's quite plausible. So I repeated the experiment about 300 miles away from New Delhi, in the middle of really rural northeastern India. Again, the same structure, 3 feet off the ground. This time in a place where the chances of a passing software developer would be minimum, So there was no chance of that happening, no chance of anybody knowing what it was or anything. And 3 months later, when I went back there, the children were playing games on the computer. So I said, hey, what are you doing? So they said, we need a faster processor and a better mouse. Which was quite a surprise in those days. So how did you learn that? And then they said something which is, I think, very, very important for all educators to remember. They said, you've given us a machine that works only in English, so we taught ourselves English in order to use it. And they said it in a complaining voice. Okay? So that's the first time I heard children describe what they were doing in those terms. And they made it sound very simple. And I thought, well, is it true? And it wasn't really true. I mean, it wasn't that they were reading out Shakespeare. It's just that they had learnt enough functional English to be able to handle the machine. And I thought, why not? Isn't that good enough for their purpose? So could it be that children will learn as much as is enough for their purpose if they think there's a reason to do so? So I repeated these experiments over and over again. I got some funding from the World Bank at that time, but here's a brief glimpse of those years. It took 5 years of experimentation to see if it would happen everywhere. This is the first day at what would be called the hole in the wall. And you'll see to the left this 6-year-old student and her 8-year-old teacher who was teaching her to browse. These are in other villages. Here's another young boy telling his older sister what to do. Here is a girl in central India, and she's speaking in Marathi, so you wouldn't have understood her, but what she was saying was very interesting. She was playing a game, and I had gone and asked her, how does it play with you like this? And she was pointing to the computer and saying, you know, there is something inside that which thinks. And she'd gotten to all that much by herself. It was pretty accurate what she was saying. There was a thinking machine behind. So I started publishing all of this, and it was years and years of work. We started to examine what else can they do. What happens if after they've learned how to use a computer? Well, the first thing we found was that they discover search engines, and they start typing their homework assignment into it. The search engine then produces whatever it produces. And I thought to myself, and the teachers, you know, would say, well, their English is fantastic. And you know, the quality of their work has changed completely. Because the internet didn't know that they were children, so the internet was throwing everything it had at them. They were reading it, I don't know how, and they were quoting the Harvard Business Review and things like that. So I thought to myself, my God, what have I done? Because this is going to ruin everything. And I missed a very important point. You know, I don't know how I could have been so stupid as to miss that point. The internet throws out at you millions of pages, and they were copying it down. I made the foolish mistake of not checking, were they copying the very first website down? Because I would have found that they were not. They were copying the right things down, and I missed it. It put me back by about 4 or 5 years. I rediscovered it when I came to England. The big question, how were they copying the right things and not the wrong things? That, I think, is the whole secret of the new education that we are looking for. Do you have, can you turn the sound up on that? No, that's not it. Hang on, I'll try it again. Well, let me tell you what I was trying to show in that. This is an experiment I did somewhere around 2002 in the southern Indian city of Hyderabad. And the problem was a very interesting problem. There were lots of schools which taught English to children, particularly poor children, because if they know English, then it improves their employment opportunities. Now, the children would learn English quite well. The schools did a good job. But when they actually went in for an interview, all their teachers were local Telugu-speaking teachers. Telugu is the language spoken in that region. It has a very strong accent. So the children had all picked up the accents from their teachers. So the interview board would then say, well, your English appears to be quite good, but I can't understand a word of what you're saying. So I said, now how do I solve that problem? Because I cannot get native English speakers to go into the slums of Hyderabad. So this experiment, what I had done was I'd taken a speech-to-text engine, you know, the kind of program where you speak into the computer and the computer types out whatever you're saying. So I gave it to the children spoke into it, and the computer typed complete nonsense. So the children laughed and said, it doesn't understand anything. So I said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll leave it here for 2 months. You have to make yourselves understood. So after 2 months, when I went back, their English pronunciations had improved considerably. In fact, what I remember is a little boy called Faisal, who was outside the classroom, and I asked Faisal in English, I said, Faisal, how are you? And little Faisal then looked up at me and said, fantastic. so I don't know what's happened in there. So what they had done is, they had downloaded something called the Speaking Oxford Dictionary. If you type a word into it, it speaks it out in a flat, neutral accent. The children would copy the accent, discuss their pronunciation with each other, practice it on the machine until the right word comes out. Now, I was thunderstruck by this. You know why? Because they had actually invented the pedagogy. Now, learners are not supposed to do that. It's people like teachers. We are supposed to create pedagogy. They are supposed to be the victims of pedagogy. But how are they creating their own pedagogy? So I thought, well, looks like they can do even that by themselves. You know, all this is not, it sounds not that fantastic today in 2014, because I think there are many mothers here who have seen their children produce the pedagogy of how to use an iPad by themselves, of how to learn to read by themselves, or how to... There's one mother here who has seen her son teach himself how to speak after the system had said he would never speak. We know that now. We didn't know it then.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
So you see them practice the same sentence over and over again. So the question at that point, this was around 2006 when I just moved to England, the question was, how far can it go? That, okay, they're impressive results. By then the world was beginning to realize that children anyway can do a lot of things by themselves. But how far does it go? So I did an experiment in 2007 or 8, I think, which had an impossible goal. The goal was, wait, I'll tell you about that experiment. The goal was that, what if I gave 12-year-olds undergraduate level examination questions in genetics with no explanation and said, here's a question, and left them alone. And the results are published. In groups, they actually answered the questions. They got about 30 or 40% of the questions right, which is absurd, because that's like 10 years ahead of time in a language they don't know. So at that time, I began to get convinced that here was a teaching and learning mechanism that is alien to us. We don't know anything about it. And it is made possible by the internet. That's why it had never surfaced before. You can't do this with books in a library. It can only happen when you have interlinked information that many people can read simultaneously. You can't do any of those things with a book. So I began to suspect there's a new mechanism at work. After that experiment, there was worldwide attention. And I began to think a little bit about what was happening. And I realized a couple of things. If you see the left-hand picture, it's quite common today of, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds with a tablet of some kind. What my work shows is that if there are more than one of them on one tablet, you get much quicker results than if you gave 5 of them 5 tablets. In any case, if you give 5 of them 5 tablets, you'll find after a while that 3 or 4 of them are onto one, and the other 3 tablets are lying there. Then I began to suspect that what we are looking at here is some kind of a collective amplification of the intellect because of grouping. I didn't quite understand it then. I understand it a little bit better now. I also thought of what's going to happen to new professions. For example, you might teach people plumbing. And they go through 3 years of plumbing, you give them a certificate, and they go away and become a plumber. And then in his first year, he goes into some house and he encounters a valve which has just come into the market, which he's never seen before. And that happens increasingly all the time. It didn't used to happen. In an earlier era, that same joint was around for 100 years before it would change. And it would change very, very gradually. Today's world, suddenly you find jointless pipe. And the valve is gone. But there's a leak, and you're the plumber, and you've been called. What can you do? Only one thing. You can pull out your tablet. And you can start searching. Will you succeed? Depends on, did they teach you how to do that in school? Where are you practiced in the art of entering the unknown with a tablet and nothing else? No background, no theory. It's intolerable to my generation. But I think we're looking at that world and we'd better think about it very quickly before we lose all our plumbers. So I started to think about reading, writing, and arithmetic. And by the way, let me tell you, became fairly unpopular in Britain because of my efforts at investigating these 3 subjects, which, in British education, and in education everywhere, they're considered pillars of primary education: reading, writing, and arithmetic. I hope you remember that earlier thing about clerks. Okay, so first of all, reading. Of course, you need to know how to read. You can't make anything, you can't do anything with the internet if you don't know how to read. So, what do we have to do with reading? We must make children read like adults by age 8. That's something I'm working on right now, and let me tell you, it's entirely possible. Start with groups. As the Kuppam experiment with biotechnology education showed, groups of children can read years and years ahead of their time if they're reading together. A book cannot be read together because of its structural format. A screen can be, if it's a big screen. So I understood something about educational technology. The little screens are not as useful as the big screens are. I had accidentally done it in the hole in the wall because I had nothing else. So I had to buy those 20-inch monitors. I realize now that it was a fortuitous accident. It actually made hole in the wall possible. If I had enough money to give little computers to all the children in that Delhi slum, let me tell you, I wouldn't be standing here today. And neither would those computers be around. Writing. Well, great, noble skill. We must teach them how to write. We must evaluate their ability to write, because writing is our way of recording our thoughts. Well, that's one way to look at it. What if I told you that there's another way to look at it? We record our thoughts by making scratch marks on thin pieces of wood, which we then bind together and call books. It's a very primitive way. It's a terrible tape recorder, prone to distortion. I write something, you read it, and you understand something else, which we then convert into a strength by saying that is literature, that, individual imaginations are interpreted in a myriad different ways, etc., etc. You can say all of that. You could also describe the act of writing as a very inefficient method of recording speech. It's a poor quality tape recorder. Well, you're very silent, I can see that. So, if I want to record my thought today, why can't I just pull out my cell phone, point it at my face, and say what I have to say? And then why don't I just upload it? Well, Many people don't like the idea. The argument from my generation again, what will happen when the batteries run out, Professor Mitra? Books don't need batteries. Well, neither do clay tablets, but we did away with them. I wonder if there was a generation where they had similar conferences saying, you know, the clay tablet has become obsolete because now we can produce thin sheets of wood. And then people would have said, how can that be sustainable? What happens when the paper-making machinery breaks down? Well, it didn't break down for the last 15,000 years or something. No, not 15,000, but 5. It hasn't broken down yet. So what happens when the batteries run out? I don't know, I don't care. I don't think the batteries will ever run out. We haven't, gone through 20,000 years of human evolution of thought in order to let our batteries run out, for heaven's sake. We'll never let that happen. So it will be batteries. It will be up there as ones and zeros, up there in cyberspace somewhere. That's the better way to write. And it will not be speech. It will be audio, video, whatever it is. A great example, in one of my classes in the university once, there's a really young Japanese girl. And I was doing a little mental exercise, pointing at a table full of things and saying, can you describe that clearly in English? And different people were doing different things. The Japanese girl was doing nothing because her English was really bad. So I asked her, what will you do? How will you describe it? And she said, well, with my mobile phone. She was quite passionate about it. She said, I'll take a picture and I'll show it to you. Why not? I mean, just because the Egyptians didn't know how to do that and had to invent writing, do we still need to continue that practice? Or should we rethink? I know it's a very hard, very, very hard rethink. But am I not allowed to ask you to rethink? Arithmetic. Arithmetic is a survival skill, I'm told. That if you are stuck on a deserted island and you need to figure out how many days you'll survive by burning 51 pieces of wood, then you would, as a matter of fact, need to know the 17 times tables. Okay? You guys all live on islands. What do you think is the chance of you being deserted on one of them? If there is a high chance, then I suggest you, memorize the 17 times tables. Otherwise, in school, you should ask why. Remember, in the old system, you were not allowed to. But in this system, and I am speaking, heaven forbid, in the front of our education minister to say, if the teacher comes in and says, today you're going to do 17 times tables, please say, why? Okay. Okay. All right, sir. I hope you heard that one. So again, it's a big dilemma for my generation. Should we let them? What will happen if we allow all of them to use their mobile phones to do all arithmetic? Somebody says to me, oh, they'll never learn multiplication. I doubt it, If you allow them to multiply using their mobile phones, do you think by the time they're 20 years old, they'll be doing 2 into 3 on the mobile phone? They'll know what the answer is. The assistive technology teaches, and we don't see it that way. So reading, writing, arithmetic, I think they ought to be under threat. What should we be telling them? Should we tell them how to grow potatoes? I mean, I'm just pretending to be a curriculum maker and say that, there should be outdoor gardening classes and we teach them how to grow potatoes. To a generation who, in 2050, if you ask them, how do you grow potatoes? They will say, with some soil and a 3D printer. Okay, or something like that. So how do you prepare them? And will we then miss the fact, they don't know how to use a little spade and put in, and the beauty of watching the plant grow, they have lost all of that. And when you ask them that, they'll say, no, there are plenty of videos on that. So, So what shall we prepare them for? We must prepare them to go one level over, one level metacognitive level over where the present system is. It's a hard job. We have to all sit and think about it, how to take that one level up. So to the class where I was going to teach the 17 times tables, I would go in and say, does anybody know where numbers came from? Who invented numbers? Why? And let them use the internet, because I as a teacher don't know the answer. I don't think any teacher does. So they'll figure it out. And when I do that, I find that they thoroughly enjoy themselves if you have 2 or 3 different conditions. One is, you're allowed to talk to each other. 2, you should work in groups, because you should actually restrict the number of computers in the classroom so that they have to work in groups. It's very healthy. And you can walk around and you can see what other groups are doing. If you tell them that the important thing is not who did it, but what is the answer to that big question, then I have never found children who have given up the fight and gone for it. The bigger the problem, the better. So, my suggestion, instead of a curriculum of things that we know, what if we had a curriculum of the things that we don't know? And we go and tell our 6-year-olds and our 8-year-olds, here are all the things we don't know. Nobody knows. Do you want to give it a try? The whole of your curriculum will in fact emerge from there. The other thing that helps is to have an adult, somebody has to do this, what I just said. Somebody has to say, I don't know the answer to this. Would you guys like to try it yourselves? Here's a big, great question. What's the example of a big, great question? They don't have to be very complicated, A good, big question could be, why does hair grow? I mean, your hands and feet don't grow longer. Why does hair grow longer and longer until you have to cut it off? Okay? Mind you, it's a silly question, but it has a very deep answer. And I think that if I asked that question today, if I had the means to ask that question, I would just need to give 4 computers to the back of the room over there, and we'll get the answer in 10 minutes flat. Okay? That's the world we ought to create. But we need an adult to do all of that, to propose the question, to make the question, to encourage the people to do it. So in 2010, I created what's called the Granny Cloud. I put out an appeal in the Guardian newspaper saying, if you are a British grandmother, if you have broadband and a web camera, can you give me 1 hour of your time per week for free? And the first 2 weeks, I got 200. I know more British grandmothers than anyone in this room, okay, including Kathy. So they are called the Granny Cloud, and you can beam them anywhere. So now I don't have that problem of how do I get a teacher into the slum. Skype will do it for me. I can get the best of the lot to go in there whenever I want. Better still, why should I push them at the children? Why can't I have a system where the children can ask for them? And they can say, we need a cell biologist. Is there a retired cell biologist somewhere? Just come online and we have a couple of questions for you. We are capable of creating that world. And we must. Here's how it looks like. Sound, please. One sec, I'll just turn it back on. Okay. Okay.
Excellent. Give yourselves a clap. Green, absolutely.
Hello, I'm Tim.
How are you?
I'm all right. Have you heard of a footballer called Wayne Rooney?
Yes.
What sort of bear does Wayne Rooney look like?
Teddy bear.
A teddy bear.
So that's more or less, it's not teaching, it's not lessons. It's a free-flowing conversation about anything under the sun. It's immensely helpful for children. So with all of this put together, in England I created what's called a self-organized learning environment. And it's really simple to do. You need broadband, you need collaboration, and you need encouragement. I did this at the primary level to start with. 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and quickly discovered that their reading comprehension and their analytical skills just skyrocket if you simply do this once or twice a week, that's all. Then the children started to ask for it. So they would say in class to the history teacher, so what are you going to do today? The history teacher says, oh, the American Civil War. So the children will say, can't we just do it ourselves? And the teacher started to let them. As soon as you do that, the whole structure begins to change. The children are now friends with the teachers because they're doing the talking, they're doing the teaching, they're doing the learning. What did the teacher do? The teacher said American Civil War. They wouldn't have thought of that themselves. That's more or less the method. Here's what it looks like. This one's in Australia.
Protons, giving it a net positive or negative electrical charge. The net charge on an ion is equal to the number of protons in the ion minus the number of electrons.
It's about 6 years ahead of our time. So that's the way it goes. And they, you could see her smiling, and it's a completely different environment. So you convert the curriculum into a curriculum of questions, big ones, so that a child reading that curriculum would say, I wish I knew what the answer to that is. So you don't say things like sines, cosines, and tangents of angles. Instead, the question might be, how does an iPad know where it is? When you say my location, it always shows you. How does it do it? That's a meaningful question. It's another matter that you need to know tangents and sines and cosines to answer that. But then that's much more enjoyable if the end goal is something meaningful. So SOLs are happening practically all over the world. Australia is leading, I think, Southern Australia. The teachers have done wonderful work. In the United States, finally, several schools have started working. In Mexico, in Europe, and of course in Britain, where all of it started. As you heard about Slumdog Millionaire, so the sort of popular culture gets affected by this idea of self-organized learning, of people doing things by themselves. And there are examples I won't go into. Here's a school in Mexico which went from the bottom of the league table to the top in 1 year by a teacher who I don't know, I've never met him, who wrote that I used self-organizing principles and minimally invasive principles in my class, and I don't know what happened, but they just went to the top of the league table. So that's the nature of self-organization. Well, an old Mike Atherton, the ex-cricket captain, was trying to describe why the Sri Lankan team had suddenly developed techniques which nobody had invented before. They invented new bowling techniques. And to my great surprise, he writes, maybe they used Sugata's hole in the wall. So if you put all that together, I decided to try an experiment once I got the TED prize, that why not try something called a school in the cloud. It doesn't mean, it's not e-learning, let me tell you. It is a place. It's like a cyber cafe for children. It's a place where children can come in, where adults can come in over the internet, where the internet is available, and where learning happens through a series of exploratory, research-oriented investigation into things that are really, really interesting for children. We've just started. This is what it looks like in Killingworth, England. You'll see big screens and group seating arrangements. So without saying so, you hint at the fact that you're meant to work in groups. So the circular seating spaces, big screens like that. This is in New Delhi, very close to the place where I first did the experiment. This is a Newton Aycliffe in County Durham in England with a granny on the wall. Another village in West Bengal. I just wanted you to see that the infrastructure doesn't have to be different for poor places and different for, it can be identical. I think children deserve to get the same equipment wherever they are. This is simple stuff. My biggest problem is broadband. Every such facility reports, including the ones in England, well, much less frequently, but the ones in India all the time saying our internet isn't working. I think that's something that ministries should focus on to say that for children. Well, I'm going to make a proposition. I'm going to say broadband should be free for children. Thanks. I mean, you know, we can give them free meals, so why can't we give them free broadband? We'll pay for it with our taxes. And when you do, in those few times when it does work, when everything works out, you can see from the faces that there isn't really very much more to say, is there? Thank you.